I know. Hello, everyone. I'm sure you're glad that you can watch this from your nice warm homes because it is pretty cold out tonight. I know I'm happy to be at home, and I want to thank you all for joining us and for supporting so many of our virtual programs that you have been, since we've been doing this way for the past couple of years. It's been great to have you join us from your homes. I do want to let you know that what we have coming up in February, we have some really good programs. Thursday, February 10th at 7 p.m., we have Hollywood Valentine, Married in the Movies. Film historian Annette Bochenek will be joining us, and she is going to be showing us clips of all different genres of movies that have wedding scenes, comedies, dramas, musicals. She also is going to show us some real life film footage from celebrity weddings. I think they're more older weddings, although I could be wrong. There could be some more current ones. But the whole theme is for it's for Valentine's Day. So the whole theme is weddings and love in the movies and in the celebrities' real lives. She's going to have photos, videos, and stories. So please join us for that. It's virtual, so sign up online. Our concert on Sunday, June 20th at 2 p.m. is also virtual. We have Maureen Christine, who is a vocalist, and she is going to be giving us a Valentine's concert. So lots of songs about love and romance, and she'll be accompanied on woodwind instruments by Michael Bazin. So I think that's going to be a really nice concert. So try to join us for that if you can. On Tuesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m., we have what I think will be an outstanding program. In honor of Black History Month, we have Connie Martin joining us. The name of her program is Pre-Civil War Quilts, Secret Codes to Freedom and the Underground Railroad. She's going to present, Connie will present music, slides, and storytelling, and display 18 beautifully crafted quilt replicas from the pre-Civil War days. I don't know if all of you are familiar with the story that, and it's true, it's not just a story, but with the history that slaves and abolitionists stitched these quilts that have codes and directions so that the slaves could escape to the North before the Civil War, during the Civil War. And what makes this even more interesting is that some of the people that Connie will be talking about are her ancestors. So she'll have the historical background, but also a personal touch. And again, another layer to make it even more exciting, her presentation is based on a book that her mother wrote, a nonfiction book called Lizzie's Story, A Slave Family's Journey. It's going to be a great program. And again, that's also virtual, so sign up online. Okay, I've given you my February goodies. and now for as I was telling our guest, our host, I guess guest, I'm the host tonight. This is my guilty pleasure. I do like some true crime. So we have Unsolved Hollywood Murders. Susan Gibberman is with us, and she is going to be talking about celebrities' unsolved murders in Hollywood. As she says, fame couldn't keep them from getting killed or catch their killers. Some of these cases have come to a dead end, and some are still open and are even currently being investigated. So I'm very excited to get more information on all of this. So please welcome Susan Gibberman. Oh, and I'm sorry, please put your questions in chat and we'll get to them either during the program or after. So welcome, Susan Gibberman.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Janet, for inviting me here tonight, because nothing I like better than a few good true crimes. There are a lot of unsolved murders in Hollywood history, and there's no way to cover all of them, or we'll be here through next Thursday. But tonight we're going to look at three of the most famous Hollywood deaths. It won't let me. There we go. William Desmond Taylor, George Reeves, and Natalie Wood. Now, I have a couple caveats before we begin. I am not a trained or a licensed investigator, but I do love doing the research on these topics. We're not going to solve the cases tonight. The intent is to provide some facts about the cases and look at some of the people police considered suspects. And lastly, in accordance with our legal system, everyone is innocent until presumed guilty. However, we're not sitting in a court of law right now, so you're welcome to jump to any conclusion you would like. So our first case tonight is the murder of silent film director William Desmond Taylor. Now, most people don't remember who he was, but this was one of the first major murder cases in Hollywood. But you have to understand what was happening in Hollywood in 1922. So in 1922, Hollywood is literally reeling from scandals that shocked the industry and the movie-going public. There's rampant drug use. There are sex scandals. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle is in the middle of his second trial for the death of Virginia Rapet, because the first trial ended in a hung jury. Now, the murder of William Desmond Taylor is basically the straw that broke the camel's back, and it forced the industry to create self-censorship guidelines that would eventually lead to the hiring of Will Hayes and the creation of the 1930s production code. Excuse me. So who exactly was William Desmond Taylor? Well, he was born William Cunningham Dean Tanner on April 26, 1872 in Ireland. His mother is an Irish gentlewoman and his father is a colonel in the army. Now, his father wants the son to follow in his footsteps and become an army officer, but William is determined to have a stage career. He runs off to London and lands a small part in a play, and when his father finds out about it, he sends him to the Runnymede branch in Harper, Kansas, which was essentially a finishing school for wayward British gents to become gentlemen farmers. Now, other accounts say that William left of his own accord and came to the United States. But he did find work in theaters here in the US. And by 1900, he's in New York and working on and off as an actor. And he meets an actress named Ethel May Hamilton. And they fall in love, they get married, and they have a daughter that they call Daisy. Now, with a family to support, and acting is not the steadiest of occupations, he begins working in a Fifth Avenue antique shop, which is financed by his father-in-law. And on October 23rd, 1908, William goes out to lunch and he never comes back. So he essentially deserts his wife and daughter without saying a word. Now, oddly, Ethel May never filed a missing persons report. So we can assume she wasn't terribly disappointed that he left. She does, however, obtain a divorce in 1912. Now, we don't know a lot of what happened to Taylor between 1908 and 1912, but we do know that he traveled throughout the US and Canada working with various acting companies. By 1912, he arrives in Los Angeles and he now has a new name, William Desmond Taylor. And he starts working in the film industry. In 1914, he gets the lead role in a movie called Captain Alvarez, and that's a picture of him in that role. And he's becoming an established star. Now, I don't know if the story is true, but supposedly Ethel and Daisy are in their local movie house in New York, and they're watching Captain Alvarez. And Ethel points to the screen and tells Daisy, "That's your father." So Daisy writes to him in care of the studio, and the two did carry on a correspondence until his death. And we know that Taylor visited Ethel and Daisy in 1921. So there obviously weren't a lot of hard feelings about his desertion. In 1914, he also begins directing films. And in fact, he's one of 26 directors that create the Motion Picture Directors Association in 1915. And he will serve as president of this organization in 3 non-consecutive terms. The U.S. enters World War I in 1917, and Taylor wants to enlist, but he's older. So in July 1918, he's aged 46. He enlists in the Canadian forces as a private. But by the time he finishes his training and sails to London, the war is over. So he never sees any combat, but he does stay stationed in Europe until April 1919, and he's eventually promoted to the rank of major with the Royal Fusiliers. He returns to Los Angeles in December 1919 and continues directing, and he directs some of the most popular stars of the era, including Mary Pickford. And then he signs with Famous Players Lasky, which is the precursor to what we now know as Paramount Pictures. Taylor lives in a duplex in the affluent Westlake area of Los Angeles at 404B South Alvarado. And the Alvarado Court Apartments, it was a group of duplexes grouped in a U shape around a garden. And a lot of the occupants of these homes were people in the film industry. Now, by Hollywood standards, Taylor leads a relatively quiet life. He lives alone. His films do well at the box office, and he has friends in the business, but he's described as the quiet type, and he's not excessively social. On Wednesday, February 1st, 1922, he spends the day running errands. And one of those is he makes a deposit at his bank of $2,500 to his savings. Now, this is equivalent to approximately $37,500 today. Now, the only thing interesting about this deposit is he had withdrawn the exact same amount just the day before. And he visits various stores. He has a swim and lunch at the LA Athletic Club. He has a meeting with Jesse Lasky at Famous Players, and he's home by 5 o'clock. Then he calls the actress Mabel Normand and invites her over after dinner. He dines alone at 6 o'clock, and the only other person in the house was his manservant / valet / cook, Henry Peavy. Now, Mabel Normand arrives around 7 o'clock that night. Her chauffeur waits by the car parked on Alvarado Street at the head of the U. And they are sitting and chatting in his living room, and they're drinking cocktails, which is, I need to remind you, this is also during Prohibition, so shouldn't be having liquor, and they're smoking. And Taylor smoked a specially made Russian cigarette that was tipped in 18-karat gold. So while Normand and Taylor are busy chatting about books and other topics, Peavy walks to the end of the court and chats with the chauffeur for a few minutes. By 7:30, Peavy has cleaned up the dinner dishes and leaves to go back to his lodging house in downtown LA. At 7:45, Taylor escorts Normand back to her car, and according to Normand, he left the front door open. He bids her farewell and promises he's going to call her around 9 o'clock. And she didn't particularly worry when he didn't call because she knew he could sometimes be a little absent-minded. Now, neighbors in the court were, one of his neighbors were the producer, Douglas Maclean, and his wife, actress Faith Cole Maclean, and they live at 406B Alvarado. Douglas is upstairs in the bedroom, and Faith is knitting downstairs in the living room. Around 8 o'clock, they both say they heard a loud report, possibly a car backfiring. Another neighbor in the group also reported hearing that same sound around 8. Well, Faith peeks out the front door window and sees a man coming out of Taylor's front door. Well, the man sees her and looks back into Taylor's house before he closes the door, and then nodding to Faith, walks unhurriedly down the walkway around the corner between the home and the garage towards Maryland Street. Now, it's a cold night in Los Angeles, so it's not surprising when Mrs. Maclean describes the man as wearing a heavy overcoat, plaid cap, and a muffler. Later on, she's going to say that the man had an effeminate walk. But when she's testifying before a grand jury and she's pressed to answer whether or not she could be certain it was a man that she saw, she said that she could not. At 8:15, Taylor's chauffeur, Howard Fellows, had been out for the evening, and he returns with Taylor's car. And he parks the car on Maryland Street and walks around to Taylor's front door. Well, he knocks on the door and he rings the bell, but there's no answer. So he just goes back to the car, parks it in the garage, and then he goes home. The next morning, Henry Peavy arrives at the Taylor residence around 7:30 in the morning, and he sees that the lights are on, and he's assumed that Taylor either stayed up late or got up early. But when he enters the living room, he sees Taylor lying on the floor on his back, parallel to his desk. And as he approaches, he realizes that Taylor is dead, which sends him running out of the house screaming, which waking up all the other neighbors in the court. Well, now that they're all up, they all start running into the apartment, which is not the best way to preserve a crime scene. During the confusion, somebody identifies themselves as a doctor and makes a cursory examination of the body and declares that Taylor has died of a stomach hemorrhage. And then the doctor quickly leaves and is never seen again. And the police arrive at around 8. Now, with all the chaos that's happening around the crime scene, it's not clear whether representatives from famous players was at the scene before, with, or even with the knowledge of the police. But somehow the studio was already well aware of the murder and were on the scene. And one of the first people was Charles Ayton, who was the general manager of Famous Players. Now, police actually allow Ayton to go upstairs, and we assume he's searching for something that might reflect negatively on Taylor or negatively on the studio. But some people also believe he was planting evidence. Now, apart from one overturned chair in the living room, there's no sign of a struggle. And if studio personnel were removing physical evidence or planting, the police still found a number of items of interest. One was a monogrammed handkerchief with the letter S, which sometime disappeared afterwards. There was a pink nightgown in a dresser drawer, and some people believe that this was a piece of planted evidence. There were passionate letters from the actress Mary Miles Minter, and a ring of keys for which they never found the corresponding locks. And on the body, there were blonde hairs. Now, in Taylor's pockets, he had $78 in cash, a silver cigarette case, and a pocket watch, and a ring, which was either a 2-carat diamond or a 2-carat sapphire ring. So it's quickly established that this was not a case of robbery. When the coroner arrives at 8:30, he turns the body over and realizes Taylor's been shot in the back and at very close range with what appeared to be a small caliber pistol. Later, it's determined it was a .38 caliber, which was not found at the scene. And during the autopsy, the coroner discovered that the bullet holes in Taylor's jacket and his vest don't match up, which means that Taylor had his arms raised, either, let's say, because he was holding his hands up like he was being robbed, or in the act of hugging somebody. There were powder burns on the coat, which meant that the gun was only inches away when it was fired. The bullet entered Taylor's left side, about where his elbow would be if he were standing normally. And the bullet angled steeply upward and then ended at the right side at the base of his neck. Outside the bungalow, police found a pile of cigarettes near the garage, as if somebody had been standing there waiting for a long time. So let's look at some of the suspects in this case. And these are not presented in any order of importance. Now, obviously, police considered Mabel Normand because she was the last known person to see Taylor alive. Now, she was known as the Queen of Comedy. She was a leading actress at the Hal Roach studio and had even been engaged to Roach at one point. She was, unfortunately, a cocaine addict, and it was theorized that Taylor, who was vehemently anti-drug, was trying to help her. Now, her career faded after Taylor's death, partly because of her cocaine addiction and partly because of the suspicion that she might be involved in Taylor's death. She made more films, but she was never as popular as she was before this. And on New Year's Day, 1924, she was involved in another death. This time it was her overprotective chauffeur, who actually turned out to be an escaped convict, who killed her oilman boyfriend. After that, theaters banned her films, and she died of tuberculosis in 1930, and she was only 38 years old. Oops. Sorry. Now, very high on the list of suspects was Edward Sands, who was Taylor's valet/cook before Henry Peavy. Now, he was born Edward Snyder in Ohio in 1894. He joined the Navy in 1911 when he was 17 years old, but he was court-martialed for embezzlement and sentenced to a year in Navy prison. And after his release, he was dishonorably discharged. Well, a year later, he enlists in the Navy again, but this time using the name Edward Strathmore. He deserts the Navy after 3 months and joins the Army. And obviously, the Army doesn't talk to the Navy because they made him a clerk in their finance department. And while he was there, he passes forged checks and then deserts the Army. And even though he's born in America, he feigns a British accent. So you can see, if Taylor was looking to hire somebody, he might like to hire somebody he thought was another Brit. Now, Taylor leaves for a London vacation in 1921, and he's going to be switching apartments with the novelist Edward Knobloch. And he's concerned that Knobloch has anything that he needs during his stay in Los Angeles, so he leaves a signed blank check with Sands in case of emergencies. So just before Taylor is due back in Los Angeles, Sands asks Knobloch if he can take a week off for a vacation, and Knobloch tells him it's okay. At that point, Sands takes that blank check and fills it out for $5,000 and fills a trunk with other valuables and then steals Taylor's car. Now, Taylor swears out a complaint against Sands, but the police can't find him. And then Taylor's home is burglarized on December 4th, 1921, and the thief stole several items of jewelry and other items and his entire stock of gold-tipped cigarettes. Then on Christmas Eve, 1921, Taylor receives a letter that's postmarked Sacramento. In it is a letter with 2 pawn tickets from a Fresno pawn shop made out to William Dean Tanner for pieces of jewelry and other items, which are discovered all belonged to Taylor. Now, the letter read, "So sorry to inconvenience you, even temporarily. Also observe the lesson of the forced sale of assets. A Merry Christmas and a happy and prosperous New Year." And it's signed alias Jimmy V. Now, police believe the name came from a play that was popular at that time called Alias Jimmy Valentine, which is based on an O. Henry story about a reformed ex-convict. The pawn dealer identified the seller as Sands, and a handwriting analysis confirmed that the note was written by Sands. And even though police considered him a very plausible suspect, they never found him. Then, of course, Peavy replaced Sands as Taylor's houseman valet, and it was Peavy who discovered the body. Now, 2 days before the murder, Peavy had been arrested for social vagrancy, And Taylor was actually scheduled to go to court on February 3rd and testify on Peavy's behalf. Now, he was cleared early on in the investigation of any involvement, and he died of syphilis in 1931. Now, you may not know the name Mary Miles Minter today, but in 1922, she was an extremely popular actress. And she had met Taylor in 1919 when she was 16 and he was 47. And she fell madly in love with him. And when they met, she was under the legal age of consent. And some believe she and Taylor had an affair, and others believe he was just trying to be a father figure to her. Now, the blonde hairs on Taylor's jacket are believed to be hers. And she gave police the explanation that she saw Taylor on the day he was murdered and stopped, and they had a quick chat, and she gave him a hug, which would account for the hairs on his jacket. But when she gave an official police statement on February 7th, she says that the last time she saw Taylor was on December 23rd. Now, Minter never denied that she was in love with Taylor, and this is one of the letters that they found in a book in his home. And over the years, her story changed. And she would later claim that she and Taylor had been engaged, and she would often refer to him as my mate. Now, because of her attachment to the Taylor scandal, her career was basically over, but she lived to a ripe old age of 82 and died in 1984. After Edward Sands, the next most likely suspect is Charlotte Shelby, who happened to be the mother of Mary Miles Minter. And she was a horrible stage mother, often referred to her daughter as the family meal ticket. And she kept a watchful eye on anyone making amorous advances to her daughter. She purportedly broke into Taylor's office and screamed at him, "If I ever catch you hanging around Mary again, I'll blow your head off." Nice lady. But reality is, anybody who showed an interest in Mary or anybody that Mary had a crush on was a target for her wrath. Now, Shelby did own a Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, and she also had some unique bullets which matched the bullet that actually killed him. But the gun was never found, and her daughter Margaret would later say that Shelby ordered it thrown into a Louisiana bayou shortly after Taylor's death. Now, she was alibied for that night by family members, if you want to believe them, saying that they were all at home the night he was killed. And remember, Faith Cole Maclean said that the man leaving Taylor's home had an effeminate walk. And many people believe that it was Shelby dressed as a man that night. And there are also stories that she was a very close personal friend of the LA District Attorney. And perhaps the DA was either protecting her or the studio because he got a lot of money from the studios for his election campaigns. And Shelby and her daughters were entangled in bitter disputes for years on how she handled their money. And she died in 1957. Then there's another theory that Taylor was killed by somebody from his past who wanted revenge. And some people say that he made enemies while he was in the army. And in fact, a rancher reported that he picked up two hitchhikers near the Mexican border one night. And on the drive north, the hitchhikers talked about a very strict Canadian captain they served under during the war, and that they were going to Los Angeles to kill him. Well, this made the rancher a bit nervous, and he pulled over in Santa Ana and told the men that this was as far as he could take them. And when the men exited the truck, one of the men dropped a gun that the rancher recognized as a .38 caliber revolver. Also that night, on the night of the murder, a man approached Hartley's service station at the corner of 6th and Alvarado and asked the gas station attendant for directions to William Desmond Taylor's home. And the press obviously had a field day with this story, and they published anything and everything they could get their hands on, even if it wasn't true. But so that just added fuel to the fire. And over the next few months, they had over 300 false confessions. But let's jump ahead 42 years to 1964. Now, the former stage and silent screen star Margaret Gibson, who now is going as Patricia Lewis, she had been married and recently widowed, and she's been living pretty much as a recluse in Hollywood. And she suffers a heart attack. And when her neighbors find her, they call for an ambulance. Now, Gibson had, in previous years, converted to Catholicism, and she was afraid she was going to die. So she asks for a priest. And when the priest is there, she confessed to killing a man named William Desmond Taylor. But at this point, in 1964, nobody in that room knew who William Desmond Taylor was, so they thought it was just an old woman's imagination. And she did die later that day. Now, her name is not mentioned in the original investigation, but there were rumors that his death might be related to a blackmail attempt, which could explain that withdrawal and deposit the day before his murder. A year later, Gibson was charged with being part of a nationwide blackmail and extortion ring. And although charges against her were dropped, 2 men that she was connected with did plead guilty. And Daisy took care of the funeral arrangements, and Taylor was buried with full military honors and is interred in a mausoleum at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And as you can see, the marker bears his real name. Now, next week is actually going to be the 100th anniversary of his murder, and there is still no definitive answer. And there are probably had more books written about the Taylor case than any other murder apart from the Black Dahlia. And this is just a sampling. So don't worry, these and others are all on the handout. Now, our next case is the death of actor George Reeves. Now, a lot of people say this is not an unsolved murder. And the cause of his death is listed as a suicide, and that finding has never changed. But there is definitely a mystery surrounding his death. Now, he was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 9th, 1914 in Woolstock, Iowa, which is about 85 miles north of Des Moines. His mother, Helen, had given birth to him less than 9 months after her wedding to Don Brewer, so she lied and told him his birthday was April 5th. Now, Helen divorced Don when George was still an infant and moved back to her home in Galesburg, Illinois. Later, she takes her son and moves to California, where she's going to stay with a sister. And it's in California that she meets Frank Besselo and marries him. And Frank adopts George and raises him as his own. So he's now known as George Besselo. Frank and Helen's marriage lasts about 15 years. And while George is away visiting relatives, Helen leaves Frank and divorces him. And when George returns, she tells George that Frank committed suicide. Now, okay, mother's a little strange. A cousin of Reeves told a biographer that George didn't know that Besselo was still alive, or even that he wasn't his biological father until years later. Now, he began acting and singing while he was in high school, and he continued performing while he was a student at Pasadena Junior College. He even took up amateur boxing until his mother ordered him to stop, fearing that he was going to destroy his good looks. Then he interned at the Pasadena Playhouse. Now, if you're not familiar with this, the Pasadena Playhouse was established in 1917, and it became the springboard for many famous alumni, and that included Raymond Burr, Robert Young, Gene Hackman, Al Pacino, and Dustin Hoffman, just to name a few. And while he's studying at the Pasadena Playhouse, he meets his future wife, Eleanor Needles, and they marry in 1940. But most importantly, it's while he's studying at the Pasadena Playhouse that George is discovered. And his first major screen role is in a little-known film called Gone with the Wind, where he plays Brett Tarleton, one half of the twin brothers who compete for the attentions of Scarlett O'Hara in the opening barbecue scene. Now, I don't know if you can read it, but the clapboard on the costume test on the left lists him as G. Besselo. And although playing Brett Tarleton is a relative minor role, spoiler alert, the twins do die early on in the war, it does serve as a springboard for his career. So soon after he's cast in Gone with the Wind, he signs a contract with Warner Brothers. And it's Warner's who changed his name to George Reeves. Now, Gone with the Wind was a huge, huge production, not only to film, but post-production. So by the time Gone with the Wind is released, even though it's his first film, it's actually the fifth one released, although his earlier films are mostly uncredited roles. Then, over the next few years, he's teetering on the edge of film stardom. He's getting better roles, and he certainly has all the qualifications of being a matinee idol because he's tall, dark, and handsome, and he's definitely garnering the attentions of the female moviegoers. But World War II intervenes, and he enlists in the Army Air Corps. And because of his acting skills, he's kept out of combat and assigned to make training films. He also appeared in the Broadway production of Winged Victory, which was an all-soldier show written and directed by Moss Hart. Now, Winged Victory ran for 6 months on Broadway and then toured the United States. And then they made a film version, which actually is completely unrelated to the play. But you can see in the credits, he's listed as Sergeant George Reeves. Now, Mark Sandrich, who directed Reeves in the movie So Proudly We Hail, always liked Reeves and told Reeves that he had big plans for him once his commitment to the Army was over. Unfortunately, before Reeves could be discharged, Sandrich, who was only 44 years old, died of a heart attack. After the war, Reeves struggles to get his film career back on track, and he's working at 3 different studios, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and Paramount, but he's just not getting the roles. And he makes over 50 films in the next 5 years, but they're mostly minor parts or uncredited. And despite making 50 films in 5 years, they paid so little that he was forced to take a job digging septic systems in order to make a decent living. By 1950, he and Eleonora are divorced, and he decides he's going to relocate to New York City, because after all, New York is the theater mecca, and it's where a new industry called television is getting started. Now, Reeves was offered the role of Superman in a feature film that was going to serve as a pilot for a possible TV series. And according to some reports, the moment he entered the interview rooms, the producers knew he was perfect for the part. Now, the Superman character had been popular since his comic debut in June 1938, and it spun off a successful movie serial and even a radio drama. When producers decided to go ahead with the TV series, Reeves was initially reluctant to take on the role because, like many actors at that time, he believed that few people would be watching television, and television would never replace motion pictures. So the TV series premiered on September 19th, 1952, and it ran for a total of 6 seasons. The first 2 seasons are in black and white, and the next 4 are in color, even though very few households at the time had color television sets. And even though he's the star of the series, it's not exactly a dream job. The salary is not great, and he's only paid for the weeks that they're actually filming. And the episodes were shot on a very, very tight schedule. In fact, they would film at least 2 shows every 6 days. And the way they did this was, let's say they had Perry White's office. They would film all the scenes for Perry White's office for the next 4, 5, or 6 episodes, strike that set and build something else. And you can imagine for an actor, this is crazy. Plus, all the actors, all the leads, had restrictive contracts that included what they called a 30-day clause, meaning that producers could call them back on just 30 days notice. Now, for an actor, this clause prevents them from trying to take another job on a film or a series or a stage play, because you never knew if you were going to be called back in 30 days. He also hated that costume, which was 100% wool. Now, if you've ever worn wool under hot lights, this is not comfortable. And he'd lose up to 5 pounds a day just in sweat. And it was rumored that he would burn the costume at the end of each season, which I find hard to believe since they were so cheap on everything. I can't believe they would let him do that. But he got along very well with the cast and members of the crew. Now, Superman eventually aired in 21 countries, and Reeves was kind of surprised to suddenly become a national celebrity. In fact, he earned more money from personal appearances than he did for the show itself. Now, in his personal life, George Reeves was not Superman. He was divorced, he drank heavily, he smoked, but he always played the superhero role to the hilt when he was making a public appearance. And his affection for the fans was genuine. He never smoked or drank where children might see him. And at these personal appearances, he could be mobbed by up to 20,000 kids. Now, there's a famous story, if you've seen the movie Hollywoodland, about a small boy who comes up to Reeves with his father's gun, wanting to see the bullets bounce off his chest. Now, the story, in fact, is not true, but kids did try to punch him to test his invulnerability. And after these kinds of incidents, he refused to appear in the Superman suit. He would always appear as Clark Kent. And when children started jumping off their roofs in an attempt to fly, because he did that little run, jump, fly motion, he went on a series of safety tours explaining, that, oh, he's from Krypton, so it's okay for him, but humans can't fly, so don't jump off your roof. He also performed and hosted a number of benefits or telethons for charitable causes. Now, Reeves had met Tony Mannix before he began working on Superman. Tony was born Camille Bernice Frooms, and she was a former Ziegfeld showgirl, but she was also married. And she was married to Eddie Mannix, who was second in command at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, second only to Louis B. Mayer. And he had the nickname The Fixer, because it was Mannix's job to protect movie stars from scandalous situations. And that might include paying people off or destroying evidence. And he supposedly had mob ties to help him. And even though Tony and Eddie were married, Eddie carried on his own extramarital affairs and was very supportive of Tony and Reeves's relationship. And it didn't bother him that Tony bought Reeves his house, decorated it for him, bought his car, paid for his clothes, paid his liquor bills. He was being very generous. Tony was 8 years older than Reeves, and she always called him the boy. And she and Reeves had worked together for 8 years. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever, and we're not exactly sure how he met Lenore Lemon, but he did. And she was a socialite who had been married twice before. One of the marriages was to the great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, but that marriage only lasted 8 days. And then she left him and kind of hung the divorce over his head until she got a nice monetary settlement. Now, she was considered a gold digger who had a reputation for being very possessive, very protective, and extremely jealous. And despite all that, she and George became engaged, and they were planning on being married in Mexico on June 19th, 1959. On the night of June 15th, Reeves and Lenore had been dining and drinking with friends at a restaurant, and somewhere in the middle of the evening, Reeves and Lenore got into a very loud argument, which was not an uncommon occurrence. They left the restaurant, and the two returned home to return to Reeves's home on Benedict Canyon Drive. They had a few drinks at home, and Reeves retired around midnight. A little later, the group they had been with at dinner came by the house. And Reeves had an open door policy at his home, but not after midnight. And supposedly he came downstairs and complained about the noise. And then after blowing off a little steam, he went back upstairs again. Now, sometime between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, the guests say they heard a shot. And here's where it gets interesting. Now, as I mentioned, Reeves' death is listed as a suicide, and there are a lot of reasons why it looks that way. Friends and his Superman castmates claim that he was depressed over being typecast and not being able to find other work. 2 months earlier, on April 8th, he had been in a major car accident, and he suffered bruises and a 5-inch gash on his forehead that required multiple stitches, and he spent a week in the hospital. After that, he was on painkillers, which may have caused some clouded thinking. Now, his blood alcohol level that night was 0.27%. Now, they didn't establish a legal limit until 1981, and even then, the legal limit was 0.1. So 0.27 is way over the legal limit. So some people believe this could have been an accidental shooting. But there is a lot of evidence for it being murder. Now, as I said, the shot was heard between 1 and 1:30, but there was nearly a 45-minute delay before the police were contacted. Now, you can say that because everybody was drinking, they may have not been thinking straight. But 45 minutes also allows time to come up with an agreed upon story. And in fact, one of the guests later told police that Lenore was upstairs with Reeves, and when she came down, told her guests, "Tell them I was down here." There were also no powder burns on the body. Now, presumably, if you're committing suicide with a gun, the gun is placed at or very close to the temple, and the absence of the powder burns meant that the gun had to be held at least 12 inches away from his temple. The gun was found on the floor between his feet, which is also kind of unusual because usually if you shoot yourself, the gun stays in your hand. And police did not find any fingerprints on the gun, but they also felt that the gun had recently been cleaned, so it was oily and you wouldn't get fingerprints to stick. Some reports say that there was blood spatter on the ceiling, which would mean his head was at a very odd angle to shoot yourself. And because police believed it was a suicide when they arrived, they didn't take crime scene photos. Another report said, oh, and they didn't test for gunshot residue on his hands, but that test was actually not common in 1959. Now, the gun that was used was a 9mm German Luger. This gun ejects the cartridge out into the right. And since he was shot in the right temple, presumably with his right hand, the cartridge would have ejected away from his body. And yet the cartridge magically jumped up and to the left and was found under his body. There were also 2 bullet holes in the floor and 1 in the ceiling, but we don't know when those occurred. And according to George's manager, yes, he was an avid gun collector, but his cardinal rule was the guns were never loaded in the home. And despite what his fellow actors claimed that he was despondent over his career, he did have other career plans. He had recently signed a contract for a 7th season of Superman, and he had directed a few episodes in season 6, and even had it added to his contract that he would direct more. He had formed his own production company and had written a pilot for another TV series that he was trying to shop around. And because of the popularity of Superman overseas, he was actually scheduled to tour Australia, which would pay him $20,000. Not a bad salary in 1959. And Reeves believed that Toni was still angry over their breakup and accused her of making nuisance calls in the middle of the night and even accused her of being involved in the abduction of his beloved schnauzer, Sam. Now, oddly enough, at the time of his death, Reeves had not changed his will, so Tony, and not Lenore, inherited his entire estate. Reeves's mother, Helen, was convinced that her son was murdered, and she hired various private investigators to look into the case. And although they believed Reeves hadn't committed suicide, they couldn't find any evidence to prove murder. So she had Reeves's body exhumed and a second autopsy performed. But the body had been cleaned, so there was nothing for them to find. Then she hired attorney Jerry Geisler, who was known affectionately as Defender of the Dam because he would take these high-profile cases like Errol Flynn's 1942 paternity case. But oddly enough, Geisler suddenly drops the case, and many people hypothesized that he was pressured to drop it by Eddie Mannix. So let's presume Reeves was murdered. Who did it? Well, essentially, we only have two chief suspects. One, Lenore Lemon. She was known to be a hellraiser and had violent argument with Reeves in public. And immediately after his death, she took $4,000 in traveler's checks, which were for their honeymoon, and fled to New York. Now remember, one of the people in the home that night claimed she tried to get her guests to lie for her, tell them I was down here. She also sued to get a share of Reeves' estate, but was unsuccessful. She lived in New York for the rest of her life, and family members say she spent the rest of her life in an alcohol dementia. And she, on New Year's Day, 1990, she was found dead in her New York apartment. Then there's Tony Mannix. She was angry and jealous over their breakup, and she still technically owned his house, so it would be very easy for her to get in. Could she have shot him? Or did she get her husband, Eddie the Fixer, to take care of things for her? Maybe using his underworld contacts? In an interview in the 70s, Phyllis Coates, who was the first Lois Lane, claims that she got a call from Tony at 4:30 that morning, and all she said was, "He's been murdered." And this would have been before it hit the newspapers or any other news media. And in later years, Tony suffered from Alzheimer's, and she had a shrine in her home dedicated to Reeves. And supposedly, she confessed that she was responsible for the death of George Reeves. And she died in 1983. 3 years after his death, Helen had his body exhumed again, and this time had him cremated, and his ashes are interred at Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena. Now, there aren't a lot of books on this case, but here are a couple of titles. Now, our last case is the death of Natalie Wood. Now, 40 years ago, this was considered an accidental death. But in 2001, the case was reopened. And in 2018, police officially named her husband, actor Robert Wagner, a person of interest. Now, Natalie was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938 in San Francisco. Her parents, Maria and Nikolai, were Russian-born emigres, and when they became American citizens, they changed their last name to Gurdon. Now, the Gurdons lived in Santa Rosa, which is about 50 miles north of San Francisco. In 1942, a production company came to town to make the movie Happy Land. And Natalia won the part of a little girl who drops her ice cream cone on the sidewalk. It's an uncredited cameo at the very beginning of the film, and if you blink, you will probably miss it. But thinking her daughter had a future in films, Maria moved the entire family to Los Angeles and tried to get Natalie cast in movies. And her first big role was as a German orphan in the movie Tomorrow is Forever with Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert. Now, studio executives wanted a name that sounded more American. So Natalia Gurdon became Natalie Wood. And she made over 40 film and TV appearances between ages 4 and 16, including the perennial Christmas favorite, Miracle on 34th Street. Now, it's been well publicized that Natalie was aquaphobic, had a fear of the water. And some will trace her fear back to an accident she suffered on the movie The Green Promise. In that movie, 10-year-old Natalie had to run across a bridge in a torrential storm, and the bridge was supposed to collapse when she got to the other side. But the bridge collapsed prematurely, and Natalie fell into the water, breaking her wrist. Now, Maria was afraid that if she reported the accident, they would pull Natalie off the movie. So as a result, the bone never set properly, and it caused a protrusion on her left wrist. And throughout the rest of her life, she either hid her hand or wore large bracelets to hide that protrusion. And you can see her wearing that large bracelet in the picture. And Natalie was one of a handful of child actors to successfully segue into adult roles. And when she was 17, she appeared as a rebellious high school student in Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean and Sal Mineo. And that earned her first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. And in fact, she got 3 Academy Award nominations before the age of 25, including one for Splendor in the Grass and one for Love with the Proper Stranger. Now, Natalie definitely had her share of romances, including one with Rebel director Nicholas Ray, who was 27 years older than her. She claimed that she had had a crush on Robert Wagner ever since she was a child when they were working at the same studio. So when she was 18, the studio arranged a date for Natalie and Wagner, who was 26 at the time. And despite her mother's objections, they married on December 28, 1957. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last terribly long, and they separated less than 4 years later and divorced in April 1962. After some other romances, including a disastrous relationship with Warren Beatty, Natalie met British writer-producer Richard Gregson, and they dated for 2.5 years before they married on May 20th, 1969. And they had their daughter, Natasha, who was born the following year. But the couple split in 1971 after Natalie discovered Gregson was having an affair with his secretary. And their divorce was finalized in April 1972. After which she resumed her relationship with Wagner, and 3 months after her divorce was finalized, she remarried Wagner, and their daughter Courtney was born in 1974. Now, according to Wood's sister Lana, because the couple had split and come back together, they were far more determined than most people to make it work. But she also quoted Natalie as saying, "Better the devil you know." Now, in their first marriage, Natalie was the much bigger star of the two. This second time around, Wagner had become very successful on television with It Takes a Thief. And I think one of the reasons this second marriage seemed to work was basically because Natalie was putting her career on hold to raise their daughters. But everything changed on Thanksgiving weekend, 1981. Now, Natalie was making her comeback film, the sci-fi film Brainstorm, co-starring Christopher Walken, who is hot off an Oscar win for The Deer Hunter. And the production was on break for Thanksgiving. So the Wagners invited Walken to join them on their yacht, Splendor, where they were going to take it to Catalina Island. And Dennis Davern was the captain of the yacht and worked for the Wagners. Now, there's a lot of information about what happened that weekend, what didn't happen that weekend, and what might have happened that weekend. The only thing we know with absolute certainty is there were only 4 people on the boat that weekend: Wood, Wagner, Walken, and Davern. Now, according to Davern, the Wagners had a horrible fight on Friday night, and Natalie had Davern take her to the island in the boat's dinghy. Now, at that time, I don't know what it is now, but the only way to get on and off Catalina Island was by helicopter or private plane. And there was nothing available to take her to the mainland until the morning. So she paid for 2 hotel rooms, one for her, one for Davern, but she and Wagner stayed up all night talking. And in the morning, she decided she was going to go back to Splendor So they go back, and she makes breakfast for everybody, and everything seems fine. At 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, Wagner, Wood, Walken, and Davern are having drinks at the bar in Doug's Harbor Reef restaurant, which is located in Two Harbors on Catalina Island, and it's also the only restaurant in town. At 5 o'clock, the quartet moved to the dining room for dinner, and according to the restaurant manager, they consume multiple bottles of champagne. But by the time they leave the restaurant, which is around 10 o'clock, the manager was concerned that the group was too intoxicated to make it back to the yacht. So he asked a member of the Harbor Patrol to make sure that they made it back safely. Now, it's believed that sometime between 10:45 and midnight that Natalie Wood went missing. And Wagner claims that the last time he saw her was at 11:45 when she said she was going to bed. Now, around midnight, a woman on another yacht nearby claims that she could hear a woman screaming. But around that same time, there were complaints of a loud party on the shore. And the accounts on this will vary because some people say the party was going on at the same time the woman heard the scream, and others say that the party was later. We do know that around 1:30, Wagner called the Harbor Patrol and told them that someone is missing from our boat. Now, a lot of the boats that are in that area, as well as the restaurant, are all have radios tuned to the same frequency, so they all hear this call. And the restaurant and the manager and the cook decide they're going to take out a boat and try to help search for Natalie. Now, members of the Harbor Patrol go to Splendor, pick up Wagner, and then take him back to the island to look for her in case she went there. After no success, the Harbor Patrol encouraged him to call the Coast Guard, which he does at 3:25. But a fully equipped search can't be launched until 6 when there's daylight. Now at 5:30, the restaurant manager and the cook find the Splendor's rubber dinghy Valiant in a kelp bed about a mile from the yacht. Now the circles on the aerial photo here are only estimates of where the yacht was anchored in Isthmus Cove and where the dinghy was found near Blue Cavern Point. When they found the dinghy, it was empty. The ignition key was in the off position, and the engine was in neutral, and the oars still in place. But they take the Valiant, so now they have 2 boats to help search. Around 7:30, the sheriff's helicopter spots a red bubble, that's the 3rd circle, about 100 yards from where Valiant was found. And they radio the coordinates to search boats to investigate. And when they get to the spot, they find the body of a woman floating in the water. It's Natalie, and she's already dead. And the red bubble was the down jacket that she was wearing. And they bring her body on board the boat to take to shore, and the coroner's office is called at 8 o'clock. Now, looking back at this case, I have a few concerns about how the investigation was handled. Again, I watch way too many crime shows. Firstly, the sheriff's department did not secure Splendor as a crime scene. And I think they may have been a little starstruck because they did not take statements from anyone on the boat and even offered to fly the 3 of them, Wagner, Walken, and Davern, to Los Angeles. Now, one of the officers who helped retrieve the body from the water noticed a lot of bruising and even said that it looked like she had been beaten. Well, the first thing you normally do that is check everybody's hands to see if their hands show any injuries, and that was never done. It also seems like the chief medical examiner of Los Angeles, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, was a little quick to make the determination that this was a tragic accident while slightly intoxicated. But 2 weeks earlier, he was the medical examiner investigating the death of actor William Holden. And he got into a lot of trouble with his superiors because they felt that Noguchi was giving out way too much information to the press. So in the Wood case, he may have felt pressure to keep his opinions to himself and wrap the case up quickly. Now, Noguchi says in his book that he assumed the scratches on the dinghy were made by Natalie's attempt to try to climb back into the boat. But then he never mentions about checking her fingernails to confirm that. When she was found, Natalie was wearing a flannel nightgown, blue wool socks, and the red down jacket. And she also had jewelry, 4 rings, a bracelet, and a necklace. Now, the toxicology results revealed she had a blood alcohol content of 0.14, just slightly above the legal limit, along with motion sickness medication and painkillers. Her stomach contents contained 500 cc's, about 17 ounces, of partially digested food in her stomach, so it's estimated that the time of death was around midnight. And it's also interesting to note that she had 300 cc's of liquid in her bladder that had not been voided. Now, a new medical examiner who was looking at the cold case determined that she was unconscious when she went into the water, which is why the contents of her bladder were not voided. But I haven't been able to find anything that actually proves that. She also had, as I said, bruises, and there was on both her legs, her right ankle, as well as a superficial abrasion on her left cheek, noted as being in a probable upward direction. Now, Noguchi claimed that the bruising was caused by her trying to climb back into the dinghy. But the new coroner in 2011 claims that these bruises happened before she went into the water. So now investigators are looking into the arguments that were happening that night. Now, there are 2 basic stories that try to explain how she died. The first was that she was attempting to leave the boat and go back to the island after their argument. However, remember, just the night before, she wanted to leave the boat after the argument, and she called Davern to take her. Now, in his book, Davern claims that Natalie relied on him for all kinds of little things. Make her a cup of tea, put on some music, babysit the girls. So why not have him drive her again? Now, Natalie's sister Lana said that Natalie was very aware of her image as a movie star and would never go out in public without being dressed, made up, and with her jewelry. And even though she was found wearing jewelry, she certainly would not have left the ship in just slacks, a flannel nightgown, and a down jacket. Another theory was that Natalie couldn't sleep because the dinghy was banging on the side of the ship and disturbing her. And when she attempted to tie it up, she slipped on the swim step and fell into the water. Now, the cleats that secure the dinghy are on either end of the stern, those circled areas in the picture. And according to Davern, you can easily tighten the ropes from the deck, so it wouldn't be necessary to step on the swim step at all and possibly fall in the water. Or again, why not call Davern to tie up the dinghy for her? But again, she did have some alcohol in her system and may not have been thinking clearly. So why are the police focused on Wagner? Well, statistically, 80% of all spousal murders, the crime is committed by the intimate partner, so that doesn't help him. You can also look at the fact that he delayed calling for help. Other people who listened to that call to Harbor Patrol have commented that his distress call didn't sound particularly distressed. And according to Davern, when they were holed up in Wagner's home, Wagner tried to get them to agree upon a story about what happened that night. And there were also conflicting statements that he's given. When police first came on board the boat, there was a broken wine bottle, which Wagner said fell over because of the rough seas. But in his autobiography, he says that he was having an argument with Walken, picked up the bottle, and smashed it against the table. He has also never given a formal statement to police, even though he says he has. He's also never taken a polygraph, although you can use the argument that polygraphs can be inaccurate. Davern, on the other hand, has taken multiple polygraphs with consistent results. Of course, he was also taking the polygraphs at the same time he was promoting his book. But one thing that makes me kind of sit up in this case and makes him look very guilty, is that even though he was acting as the grieving widower and claimed Natalie was the love of his life, it only took him 8 weeks to begin dating Jill St. John. And that's confirmed in his autobiography. So what the exact truth is and what happened that night, we are probably never going to know. Their daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, believes her mother died as a result of an accident and doesn't feel Wagner had anything to do with it. And she even produced a documentary last year trying to show that he wasn't involved. And it's possible that because of drinking involved, that if you say he did it, maybe it's a case of involuntary manslaughter. You know, maybe he hit her, he didn't realize she fell in the water. But because of the statute of limitations, the only thing police could charge him with now is first-degree murder. And there's certainly no proof of that. So Natalie was buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Robert Wagner has been married to Jill St. John since May 1990, and he's going to turn 92 on February 10th. And again, here are some titles that you might want to read about Natalie Wood. And just this past November, Natalie's sister Lana released her own book on the case, and no real surprise here, she kind of points a finger at Wagner. And if you're interested in something general about unsolved murders or Hollywood deaths, here are some other titles I can recommend. And if you're a fan of podcasts, here are a few of my favorites. Again, these are all on the handout, and if not, you can contact Janet for that list, or she can give you my email. So I just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Janet. Appreciate the opportunity to present this program tonight. And I'll be happy to stick around if anybody has any questions. Now stop.
We don't have any in the chat right now. Do any of you have any questions for Susan? Wait a minute, maybe.
Are there any films based on the topic?
Another.
Thank you. There are movies. There's a movie based on the William Desmond Taylor, and there's Hollywoodland. I think I'm gonna say the William Desmond is called Hollywood Story. I may be wrong. It's not exactly accurate, and neither is Hollywoodland, but they're interesting movies. Natalie Wood, I don't think there's been anything except the documentary.
Any other questions for Susan?
I know it's a lot of information to throw at everybody at once.
It is, but it's, are there any films based on, that was the same one.
That was it, I think.
Thank you so much, is what Jessica said.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for coming. I would like to pose a question to the group, and that is, I do other Hollywood murder programs, but is there somebody that you'd particularly like to see covered in another possible program? Because I'm always gathering information. Think about it. You can all get back to me too.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank, excuse me, let me have a sip of water before I do it.
I've been doing that too.
I want to thank Susan once again, and thank all of you for joining us and supporting our programs. And Susan, Robert Wagner did not do it.
You don't think he did?
No.
My personal opinion, I think it was involuntary manslaughter. I think he hit her because that upward direction is like somebody slapping you in the face. I think she fell in the water and he just didn't notice.
Maybe Christopher Walken hit her.
Yeah, he's actually given a statement to police recently, but they won't release what he said.
Oh, well, that's not good. We want to know what he said.
They have to keep it close to the vest because they don't want information getting out.
That's true. Okay, it's just that I've had a crush on Robert Wagner my whole life. All right, so I can't have him killing Natalie, who I love too. Okay, well, I will be in touch, and I know you have other programs, so I'll be looking at some of the other ones. Maybe you can come back and share more information with us another time, maybe even in person.
I'd love to.
Okay, and I hope to see everybody February 10th for our Hollywood Valentine movies, Married to the in the Movies, and we kind of have a Hollywood theme going on, don't we, this month? So I hope to see you all then. Thank you for coming. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.